Service without a uniform. Chapter 1. The Last Outpost. Thomas Wells woke early, as always, before the sun had even risen. In the mountains, morning arrived slowly. First a faint glow painted the tops of the pines, then rays crept down the slopes, catching on rocks, and only after that did they reach his home. An old but sturdy cedar structure perched nearly 2,000 meters above sea level. Frost still clung to the windows, a silver residue from the night, and only the steam rising from the coffee cup in his calloused hands reminded him the day had begun. Throughout his life, Thomas had repaired many things: transformers in town, relay stations along the highway, even generators at remote weather outposts. But the most important, the most personal of them all, was the small airstrip on the edge of his land. It was simply known as Outpost 7A, a gravel strip 100 meters long, marked at its corners with 3 rusting iron flagpoles and an old faded Air Force symbol painted on the ground. It didn't appear on maps. It wasn't listed in any registry, but everyone who served at the nearby base knew about it. Drone pilots used to fly in here, first just for navigation, later to simulate tricky landings. Occasionally, surveillance helicopters would arrive. Sometimes no one came at all. But Thomas was always ready. He inherited the land from his father, who had received it from his brother, killed in Korea. Since then, the Wells family hadn't just lived on this land. They served it. Without uniforms, without orders, but with unwavering commitment. His father had once cleared the strip by hand, carried kerosene cans, and set up spotlights for night approaches. Thomas went further. He installed electricity, put up infrared beacons, and even built a small shack with a radio signaler. He didn't do it because anyone asked. He did it because he knew someone needed it. For years, it all felt natural. Once a week, the same drone would arrive, hover over the strip, make a pass, and fly away. Occasionally, young men in uniform would come by to fix equipment or calibrate systems. They'd ask Thomas if everything was all right. He'd always nod, point out where the rocks were, where not to park. Sometimes he'd brew coffee and simply watch the machines disappear into the sky. He knew they were training, and that perhaps these exercises would later save someone's life. That was enough. But in the past 2 years, things began to change. Fences appeared lower down the slope. Neighbors started selling their land. First, Miller's farm was bought out by a resort company. Then old Henley's lot became a satellite hub. And now only Thomas remained, like the last outpost not yet overtaken by advancing modernity. The land around him no longer belonged to the forest or the wind. It now belonged to Altivex Systems, a corporation buying everything it could. They didn't want the peak for drones or training. They wanted another glass and concrete research center with parking lots and access roads. Thomas received letters, polite at first, then more insistent. They offered good money, more than he could earn in 10 years. He read them silently and tucked them away in a drawer. He knew if he sold the land, the airstrip would vanish. No one would preserve it. No one would check the beacons or power supply. No one would remember that pilots once trained here. They'd level the ground, pour asphalt, and forget. He didn't complain, didn't write letters, didn't call the base. But every evening he would walk to Outpost 7A and check everything himself. The lights, the transmitters, the markings. He knew its days were numbered. He could feel it in the air, like the calm before a storm. That spring, a letter arrived marked final notice, signed by lawyers and sealed by the county, a buyout offer labeled mandatory compliance. He didn't open it right away. For several days it sat on the kitchen table. Then he simply went outside, took an old plywood board, found some leftover paint, and nailed a sign at the entrance to his land. He didn't know who would read it. Maybe no one. Maybe only the wind between the rocks. The sign read, Outpost 7A, Military Training Zone. Closing. Thank you for 50 years of service. He wrote those words slowly, not because he lacked the strength, but because it meant the end. The end of what he had devoted most of his life to. Not military service, but something deeper, devotion. Chapter 2. The notice on the door. Several days had passed since Thomas Wells nailed his handmade sign to the post by the entrance. It stood there by the road, fading under the sun, slightly askew from the mountain wind. Only a few locals passed by, asking no questions. Some might have understood what the words meant. Most, probably not. This was a corner of the world where everything slowly faded with time, including the memory of why and for whom Outpost 7A had once existed. The morning came with mist and an unusual dampness for the region. Thomas awoke with a heaviness in his chest, not from illness, but from a feeling he couldn't quite describe. It had grown in him since the arrival of that official letter, still unopened. It now lay on the edge of the kitchen table, its curled corner betraying that someone had flipped through it. Thomas hadn't touched it. He already knew what it said, even without seeing the seal. Instead, he poured himself a cup of coffee and stepped outside. The moist air soaked into his clothes and the sky hung low, pressing on his shoulders. Drops clung to the trees. Everything around him seemed to hold its breath, waiting. He passed the old workshop where his father's tools still hung on the wall, neatly arranged like in a museum. Then he followed the gravel road leading to the airstrip. The strip was empty. No tire marks, no recent landings. Thomas's gaze drifted westward to where the slope had already been flattened by bulldozers. Pratt's former field, now the site of a future research facility. A massive crane loomed over the slope like a steel crucifix. Returning home, he saw a vehicle parked by his mailbox, a black SUV with tinted windows. Its door was open, and someone was affixing a paper in a plastic sleeve to the front door of his house. Thomas walked toward it slowly, without haste. The person was already getting back into the vehicle. The engine started, and the SUV drove away, leaving faint tracks on the damp road. A notice now hung on his door, typed with several signatures and the county seal. It stated that, under new zoning policies, his property had been reclassified as a prospective zone for high-tech development. He was being offered compensation far exceeding market value. At the bottom it read, "You have 21 days to comply with the decision." He took the notice down, folded it neatly, and placed it on the hall table. Then he sat, not in a chair, not at the table, but just on the porch step. He stared ahead but didn't see anything specific, just an image of construction cranes rolling onto his airstrip, erasing everything he had built with his hands. The markings, the beacons, the old tower painted red and white, all fading from memory. All of it would disappear. And with it, the memory of decades of training, of the young servicemen he'd greeted, some of whom never returned. Thomas knew he had little legal ground to stand on. The airstrip had never been officially registered as a military facility. Everything had depended on an unspoken agreement, on respect, the kind not written into law. He had been supported because people trusted him, but now all that remained was a piece of paper on the door. He spent the day in his usual routine, as if nothing had happened. He cleaned the lenses of the light beacons, checked the generator, trimmed dry branches along the path to the supply shed. Inside, everything followed its usual order, as if the notice didn't exist. But within him, a hollowness was growing, deep and thick, like the air before a long rain. He didn't intend to surrender, but he also didn't know where to turn. Write letters? To whom? Call? He had no contacts, no lawyers, no resources, only land, hands, and memory. He knew one thing. If he left, no one would carry on. No one would set the markers at night. No one would turn on the transmitter. It would all end. Not with an explosion or a scandal, but with silence, like dust blown from the gravel by the spring wind. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, he stepped out onto the porch again. The wind swayed the sign by the road. Thomas walked over, adjusted it, drove the nail in deeper. Then impulsively, he took out some paint and added another line at the bottom. In small, almost invisible letters, "We didn't just protect the land, we guarded honor." He added a period and stepped back. This was his statement, not to a court, but to time. Chapter 3. Echoes of Outpost 7. A few days had passed since Thomas found the notice on his door. Time seemed to move differently now, slowly, heavily, like thawed water trickling during the off-season. He kept rising early, just as he always had, and he continued inspecting the airstrip as if nothing had changed. But something inside him had shifted, not fear, not anger, more like the sensation of becoming invisible. as if everything he had done was visible only to him, and now it was vanishing without a trace. He felt it most keenly in the evenings, standing by the radio shack, listening to silence. No signals came through. One afternoon, while he was adjusting cables near the old generator, a car pulled up to the edge of the property. It was unfamiliar, white with yellow press tags. A young woman stepped out, camera on her shoulder and a backpack on her back. She didn't introduce herself or fuss. She just raised her camera and began taking photos. Thomas saw her but didn't approach. He watched from the workshop as she photographed the sign by the road, the airstrip, the old tower, even the neatly stacked crates of marking flares. She spent about an hour there. Then she got back in the car and drove away, without a word, without explanation. The next day, the clerk at the village store handed Thomas the local paper. On the front page was a photo of his sign nailed to the wooden post, with a gray sky behind it. The caption read, "One man, one outpost, 50 years of invisible service." Below the image was a short article describing how Thomas Wells had quietly maintained a military drone training site for decades, without payment or recognition. It mentioned his family's earlier generations, the tradition, his grandfather's work during World War II. The tone was modest but respectful. The byline named the same woman with the camera. At first, Thomas didn't think much of it. He brought the paper home and laid it next to the notice. But by evening, his landline began to ring. An unfamiliar number. He didn't answer. An hour later, again, then again. People had started to call. Veterans, locals, even strangers from other states. They had read about him online. The photo of the sign had spread across social media. His silent, sun-faded airstrip had suddenly become a symbol of something larger, something people seemed to have forgotten but still longed for. Devotion without reward, service without a uniform, remembrance without a monument. Veterans shared their stories. Some remembered Outpost 7A. They recalled how their crews used the infrared beacons in the fog, how the strip was always clean and ready, how there was a light glowing in the distant shack, a sign that someone was there. One even posted an old photo, a helicopter over the airstrip, snow-covered mountains in the background. Others added theirs. Gradually, a mosaic formed, hundreds of voices, memories, fragments. People didn't just recall the outpost, they remembered what it had meant to them in moments that mattered. By the next evening, the article's hashtag was trending on military forums. Thank you videos began to appear. Someone recorded a song. Another drew an illustration, a drone soaring over a mountain peak. Thomas watched it all on his old laptop, sitting at the wooden table, still not fully grasping what was happening. It was like an echo, long, powerful, awakened by a single message to the sky. But the message had been his own, the wooden sign he had nailed by the road. Later that night, he received an email. He rarely checked his inbox, but for some reason, he did this time. It was a short message from someone at the nearby base, a note of gratitude and a request to speak. No mention of land purchases, no legal language, just acknowledgement. It was strange, unexpected, hopeful. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He went out to the porch and stared into the dark sky. No lights, no rotor hum, only stars and silence. But inside, he felt something. Not victory, not triumph, but the quiet knowledge that someone had finally heard. That everything he had done hadn't vanished into the void. That Outpost 7A had echoed in other hearts. The echo had traveled far, and now it was returning. This was only the beginning. Chapter 4. The Mountain Line. A week had passed since the article about Outpost 7A was published. For Thomas, it felt like a strange transition, a quiet passage between the past, where everything was clear, and a future whose outline he could barely make out. The world around him seemed to have sped up. Emails arrived daily. People from across the country wrote messages of gratitude, shared personal memories, and recounted their first drone landings on his strip. Stories of cold nights and first mistakes corrected during those early training flights. But it wasn't just words that changed things. At some point, his old landline rang again. This time, Thomas picked up. The voice on the line was calm, professional, an aide to a general at the Air Force Command. The man said the story had reached the kind of ears that won't ignore it. He promised to escalate the matter to someone higher, much higher. The next day, the phone rang again. A different voice this time, firm, composed. He introduced himself as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Thomas didn't know what to say. He just listened. The voice asked about the airstrip, about the details, how long it had been in operation, what equipment had been used, how the coordinates were maintained. Thomas answered, slowly, clearly, year by year. There was no pride in his voice, only facts, dry, precise, like the branches of an old juniper tree. After a long pause, the man on the line said, "Give me 24 hours. I'll do everything I can." Thomas didn't allow himself to believe it, not because he lacked faith in people, but because he was used to nothing changing. He returned to his routine, checking batteries, tightening bolts in the radio shack, moving sandbags closer to the beacons. Not because he expected a miracle, but because it was the right thing to do. It was his duty, even if no one else saw it. The next morning, something felt different in the air. The silence was not natural, not the kind you get in the mountains, but dense, like the air itself was holding its breath. He had just stepped out of the workshop when he heard the sound. A low hum, faint at first, then growing louder. Rotors, but not just one. Several. Within minutes, silhouettes appeared over the trees. First an Apache, then 3 Blackhawks. They flew in tight formation, calm, precise, like during a military exercise. Thomas recognized the markings. These weren't training aircraft. They were machines from the top tier, the Pentagon's own. One by one, they hovered above the airstrip and touched down smoothly. 2 men exited one of the helicopters, dressed in black with briefcases in hand. No unnecessary movements. They walked toward the house. Thomas stood on the porch, unmoving. Inside, everything tightened. This was the moment where past and future merged into a single point. The 2 men were generals. One of them extended a folder. It was done dryly, with precision, but with respect. The document stated that the airstrip was now designated a protected military asset. The government would take over its leasing and maintenance. No corporation, no local authority could now claim the land. Everything Thomas had done was recognized as part of the official national defense infrastructure. He signed. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of the moment. Not everything was lost. His work, his land, his family's memory. It was now protected not just by him, but by the country. He was told the order took effect immediately. The documents had been cleared at the highest level. Meanwhile, the military team moved on, to local municipalities, to the developers. Altavex Systems had no options left. The construction was canceled, and the surrounding lots were granted the same status. Miller's Farm, Henley's Plot, even Old Prattsfield, all were now federally restricted. Farmers, once preparing to leave, received calls. They could stay. Where the sound of bulldozers had echoed just yesterday, now there was only silence and a quiet sense of authority. Not brute force, but deliberate presence. That evening, Thomas sat on the steps, just like on the nights when he thought it was all over. Only now his gaze wasn't downcast. In his hands, he held a copy of the signed agreement. On the strip, the lights burned steady. No flicker. The air smelled of kerosene. Somewhere beyond the ridge, another drone took flight. Service continued. Only now it was recognized. Chapter 5. At dawn. The morning didn't begin with alarm, but with a rare stillness. The wind that usually tore through the mountain slopes had quieted, and the air seemed suspended between cold and warmth. Thomas woke just minutes before the first light broke, even though he hadn't set an alarm. His body simply knew. Today was different. He got dressed in his usual clothes, heavy jeans, a flannel shirt, and the old jacket stitched at the seams. His work boots, stained with machine oil, stood by the door. Everything was as it had always been, and there was strength in that, as if familiar things could hold time and place. The kitchen still smelled faintly of wood smoke from the night before. Thomas put on the kettle and glanced at the table. The papers signed the day before lay there, smooth sheets embossed with seals, signatures, and official stamps. He wasn't a man for paperwork, But he hadn't moved these documents. It felt like they needed to lie there for a while, to absorb the first morning light before becoming part of the record. He stepped onto the porch. The sky was beginning to pale along the edges. Mountain peaks still sat in darkness, but to the east the light was rising. Thomas passed the workshop, where everything remained just as his father had left it. Wrenches on hooks, spare bulbs in a drawer, even the old helmet on the shelf, its emblem worn with time. He walked on toward the strip. The gravel crunched underfoot, and each step echoed in his chest like a heartbeat on a well-worn path. The airstrip shone. Not literally. There was no gold, no gleam. But everything was clean, leveled, ready. The beacons blinked in their precise rhythm. The wires stretched taut like strings. Even the breaker panel had been scrubbed to a bone-white shine. Yesterday's visit had left not a trace of disruption, only a sense of order, like military precision had walked the perimeter and measured every inch. He stood at the center of the strip, just as he used to when personally checking the marker alignment. He inhaled. The cold air pinched his lungs but didn't hurt. It was familiar, like a sip from a mountain spring. Then he heard it. At first just a faint hum, then a growing, deep roar, somewhere beyond the ridge, behind the trees. He knew that sound better than any other. A helicopter, not a training run, not one of the quiet monthly check-ins. This one was heavy, loaded, flying on a strict course. Then another, and another. One by one they appeared over the horizon, first as dots, then as shapes, then full machines with spinning rotors, gleaming metal, and insignias Thomas recognized instantly. 4 helicopters landed on the strip, precisely on their assigned coordinates. Dust whipped up by the rotors blurred the view, but Thomas could see people stepping out. They moved in formation, calm, composed. Some carried folders, others hard cases, tablets. 2 were in high command uniforms. Behind them, engineers, technicians. Everything was quiet, efficient. One of the generals walked over and gestured toward the house. Thomas led them inside into the kitchen, where the scent of pine wood and freshly brewed coffee lingered. He poured the cups, not out of formality but habit. The guests accepted without protest. Spreading out the documents, the officers explained the new terms. The property was now listed in the Federal Register as a strategic technical training zone. Access by third parties was restricted, security protocols were implemented, yet Thomas retained full residential rights and continued oversight of operations. Moreover, the government was entering into a formal 25-year lease with him, renewable. Their obligations were serious: regular supplies, equipment maintenance, modernization. But most important of all, the strip kept its name, its purpose, and its story. He signed. His hand trembled, not from anxiety but from the weight of the moment. The documents were collected, a copy left behind. One officer handed him another envelope, a personal letter from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. It contained no medals or citations, just a few honest, handwritten words of gratitude and acknowledgement. Later, Thomas would place it in the drawer where he kept his father's dog tags. By noon, the helicopters lifted off. One by one, they disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind silence. But this silence was different now, filled with meaning. Thomas stood by the beacon and looked upward. His land had remained his labor had been honored, and his strip, his outpost, was now officially once again a part of the country's defense network. A mountain line running through generations. Chapter 6, Below the Radar. Months had passed since the morning the helicopters descended onto Thomas Wells airstrip, carrying generals and documents that changed everything. Since then, life on Outpost 7A had settled into a new rhythm, one that was unfamiliar in structure, yet oddly familiar in spirit. New people appeared, new processes began, but everything unfolded quietly, without fanfare or flags. The airstrip remained just as it had been for decades. Modest, immaculate, ready. As if time moved differently here. The first few weeks were filled with work. A team of Air Force technicians came almost daily. They upgraded the communications tower, replaced old cabling, and installed an additional transmitter. But they didn't discard the old equipment. They carefully preserved it as a memory. A new lighting control system allowed the beacons to be managed remotely, but Thomas still operated them manually. That's how he was used to doing it. That's how it felt right. New signs began to appear on the property, placards marking federal protection, discreet surveillance cameras, and underground security grids. But all of it remained nearly invisible. Those who came for work quickly realized that it wasn't procedures that governed this place. It was respect. Thomas didn't bark orders or monitor every move. He simply was there. His presence, stooped, persistent, quietly commanding, became part of the landscape, like the solitary pine tree on the ridge. People addressed him as an equal. They listened. Sometimes small groups of cadets came through. They stayed overnight to run simulations in low visibility conditions. Thomas met them silently, guided them to the strip, watched from the slope. He no longer lit the beacons himself. His grandson Jake did that now. The boy had just returned from college and decided to stay. Thomas didn't ask why. He didn't need to. In the Wells family, such choices were always made silently. Jake adjusted quickly. He helped with maintenance, studied the old wiring diagrams, asked about small details others overlooked. He wore the same type of work jacket Thomas had worn in his youth, and he already knew every bump in the gravel strip. Thomas noticed a familiar look taking shape in the boy's eyes. Focused, thoughtful, free from pretense. It was the look of someone who understood why he was here. Evenings remained as they always had. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. Sometimes Thomas would sit on the porch and watch as a drone made its approach. Smooth, precise, on course. The beacons etched clean lines in the darkness, and the sight never got old. Every landing reminded him, none of this was in vain. Little had changed inside the house. Above the table hung the same wooden sign, now framed. Military Training Zone, closing. Thank you for 50 years of service. Beneath it, a new printed plaque. Site 7A, Protected National Defense Zone, not subject to seizure. And below that, Thomas had nailed one final handwritten line. Below the radar, above conscience. Reporters still came from time to time, but he rarely agreed to interviews. He didn't mind the attention. He just didn't feel the need to explain what was already clear. The story had already happened. Those who needed to hear it had. For the rest, the airstrip spoke for itself. The painted beacons, the leveled gravel, the clean horizon. In those details lived more truth than in any headline. Altivex never returned. Their representatives had once attempted a meeting, but they left silently after being handed copies of federal orders and satellite images showing the exclusion zone. They understood. This place was no longer within reach. Outpost 7A had been removed from their portfolio. It wasn't even mentioned in presentations anymore. In closed circles, they called it the lost point. With irony, yes, but also with respect. Sometimes Thomas wondered why it had happened the way it did, why people had listened, why the story hadn't been drowned in the noise of the world. He had no clear answer. Maybe people were simply tired of noise and needed something real, something that didn't ask to be seen, but kept serving all the same. Something that remained, even if no one was watching. He no longer felt alone. Though few people visited the outpost and most of the work still rested on him and Jake, he knew now that he was part of a system, a special one, hidden outside protocols, below the radar, but at the heart of it all. And then one evening he stepped onto the slope again. The wind was fresh, not harsh, but sharp. A drone moved across the sky. Lights blinked on the ground below. Inside the house, a warm light glowed. Jake stood on the strip, checking the equipment. And all of it, the wind, the lights, the silence, wasn't an ending. It was continuation. Because as long as the beacons shine, as long as someone is waiting for a safe landing, there's still more ahead.